Probably, like some of you, my first experience delving into the impenetrable imagination of Junji Ito was the enigma of Amigara Fault, which might sound like a bit of a cliche given it's the internet's go-to popular Ito fiction, but this short story had a compelling effect on me. It was new and distinct, something that unearthed a symbolic illustration of the kind of horror I love the most, a mixture between the relatable everyday and subtle transition to more elaborate, perplexing, and sometimes pulpy levels of terror, prolific in J-horror. But before we go any further, I truly want to avoid stepping on the toes of my boy Super Eye Patch Wolf and pulling a Philip Mewson, so if you want a wonderfully articulated explanation as to how Ito's work perfectly exemplifies the horror genre as a whole, go check out his video, because I'm going to spoil the crap out of my examples for this analysis. You've been warned. Anyway, Amigara Fault tells the story of two strangers who felt an urge to visit a fault generated by an unexpected earthquake where people believe they have seen human-shaped holes personally built for them. Soon people feel a desperate need to enter and are consumed deeper into the abyss, leaving us with an ending several months later on the other side of the fault, not staring at human-shaped holes, but instead ones that simply look like cracks. And what we see inside is this. There is no resolution or explanation for this event. What Ito leaves us with is a disturbing visual stimulus that plays on our psyche. Ito's work can be best described as, well, indescribable. As Wolf points out in his video, there is no conventional plot structure or tropes we're accustomed to. Everything we see is designed to make us deeply uncomfortable, and artistically, it's genuinely refreshing. I think, in retrospect, Amigara Fault acts as a strong introduction to Ito's work. It's great at showing us how he relies on escalation and ambiguity as a means to draw us in, occasionally throwing abrupt imagery to surprise and overwhelm us. Admittedly, I think it also highlights that Ito isn't necessarily the strongest storyteller in terms of characterization or dialogue, but it becomes irrelevant when the core principle of each story is purely the provocative and impactful presentation of the illustrations and using the characters as a vessel for human vulnerability. Amigara Fault gives away its outcome during a dream sequence that implies a backstory to the fault, which I assume was to show how psychologically obsessive the human-shaped holes were to people and eventually tempted them to enter, even if the subtle urge to simply go to the fault to begin with is enough for the reader to feel suspicious. But its effectiveness, I feel, rests in the strong use of dark saturation in comparison to much of the panels that came before it. It keeps this obscure creature shadowed and seemingly part of the environment, yet still dominant and otherworldly in presence, with the line work indicating the eyes and skin deformities to emphasize the painful body horror. This isn't a human anymore, it's a monster, or at least, it's something else entirely. Since there's no reason or motive given to the horror, it makes us powerless to the danger, and keeps the purity of the idea firmly mysterious and thus more alluring. Even from Ito's Lovecraftian inspiration, it captures that existential unknowingness that eats away at our desire to understand it. I feel Tomie and Uzumaki could literally be their own video. I haven't finished reading the latter. So instead of delving into that cosmic horror, I want to call attention to Ito's use of cultural superstition, thematics, and, well, humor. In many stories, Ito seems to play on concepts related to social pressure, conflict, and tradition, but shows the fallacy behind them with negative or bittersweet outcomes. You could interpret Amigara Fault as an exaggeration of our egocentric obsession and overreaching curiosity. The neighbor's window is literally about the distrust and fear of danger living close to you in plain sight, and then you have hanging balloons, where a character sprinkles salt to ward off evil and invite good luck, while in Scarecrows, people begin to plant scarecrows next to the graves of their loved ones because they believe their spirit manifests inside. In the last example specifically, this ritual should be seen as a positive, but results in those deceased becoming onryos, vengeful spirits capable of causing harm to the living. And of course, it's also continued with the overriding theme of death feeling somewhat incomplete, that life has ended with unfinished business, thus presenting a chance to create peace. But with Edo, peace doesn't necessarily equate to our traditional interpretation of happiness. Something I always noticed about Edo is his influences Keizu, Umezu, and Hachi Hino, artists who bring an almost surreal sense of humour to their horrific imagery. Now, I'm obviously not as familiar with their work, so it would be disingenuous for me to interpret beyond that, but there is something devilishly cartoony and frightening about their work that's also apparent in Edo's. As Edo himself explained, sometimes the conflicted similarities between horror and comedy create an emotional paradox we tend to associate with tragedy. And nowhere is this more true than in what I think best encapsulates Edo's style, a story that is conceptually ridiculous, borderline absurd, and yet somehow still extremely harrowing. This is The Hanging Balloons. This story is literally about the invasion of balloons, each shaped as the head of their victim, carrying a noose in which to hang said victim, and it makes for a genuinely unnerving read. There is an unspoken gallows humour to the story where it constantly throws a screw you to the audience by escalating the horror in dire ways. It actually transcends similar concepts used in the Amigara Fault story, in which we open to our traumatized protagonist trying to ignore the tempting voices of what seemed to be herself, transitioning us into a flashback, introduced by an abrupt and starkly composed suicide. Edo's stories are all about the build-up lingering in the back of your mind's anticipation, but that suddenness is emotionally jarring to give that spontaneous rapid feel, a feeling that anything could happen, leaving us cautious and unprepared for what comes next. The significance of the death being a famous and beloved celebrity plays into what I assume is the theme of the story, one where she is seen as to have broadcasted her suicide, leading to her practically being worshipped and the distress and agony it has brought to her fans, some of which being driven to copycat suicides. When sightings of her ghostly head emerge, madness seems to transpire before more heads arrive, and things get immediately chaotic from there. Some dude who just casually owns a crossbow tries shooting the heads down, but it still kills the victim in an unexpectedly grisly yet somehow darkly comedic manner. Even at home, the protagonist's family hide indoors as their heads float outside waiting to kill them, but that doesn't stop the dad from nonchalantly going to work because he has too much to do, thinking he could just safeguard his neck and bye-bye. And then the son gets the idea to trap an umbrella in the noose, and it works temporarily for him to escape, but he goes missing for several days. The mother soon abruptly falls victim out of motherly love, taking us back to the opening, where our protagonist has witnessed her friends and parents die violently before her, while unsure what happened to her brother. It's like a torturous mockery to the character to make her persistently suffer, and the final burn to both the character and the reader is the glimmer of hope to emerge with the return of her brother knocking on the window. And as she runs relieved to help him, "Ah, you son of a bitch! Why would you do that?" If the intimacy of these stories suggest one thing, it's just how close we are to danger and death. It's a mixture of facing our mortality and simply the inconsequential nature of life. Hanging Balloons especially shows us just how easy it is for life to be taken away from us. Junji Ito's understanding of horror is rooted in removing any glimmer of a safe haven. It's a visually relentless nightmare, one associated with the feeling of futility we all inevitably face. His work isn't cynical, but it points out a frightening reality of desperation and selfishness. I find most of the main characters to be individualistic in nature, self-absorbed with their own perception of the horror in front of them, like any of us would be. It makes all the craziness of his style grounded in honesty, an honesty in which he draws from the everyday, and finds a way to make our ordinary, mundane existence just a tad bit more interesting. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite Junji Ito story is, and suggest some other horror, manga, and even anime to me, because it's something I'm still getting used to. I have to give a shout out to Super Eye Patch Wolf for introducing me to Ito in the first place. This has been a very long-standing request. Until next time, if you enjoy the show and you want to help me to keep making videos, please do consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you can get early access and vote on future videos. And yeah, go follow my shenanigans over on Twitter. Stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.